The next slot is Deputy Broin, please.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, I do want to start with the home completion figures for last year. So as you know, the CSO data is based on ESB connections, and they have a pretty sophisticated methodology to try and clean those figures from the previous methodology used by the department. The issue that has arisen, and it's not about the integrity of the CSO, it's about the difference between ESB connection data and completion certificate data through the building control management system. And as you know, before a residential building can be occupied legally, there has to be a completion certificate. So the question, and I think it's a very reasonable question, and I do think it is one that you do need to consider and respond to, is when you look at the completion data, the completion certificates for last year, there's a 6,000 unit gap between the ESB connections data and the completion certs. When you then look under the bonnet of that and see, so where is that discrepancy? Almost all of it is in the large urban centres, and almost all of it is in large residential developments. So what that's telling us is two different data sets, and they're not necessarily equivalent, are telling us two very different things. Given that a building cannot be legally occupied until it has a completion certificate, do you not think at least it merits asking the question, why is there such a big difference between the ESB connection methodology, which the CSO uses legitimately, and I have no question with that, and another set of government data, which is the completion certificates through the building control management system? That's a big gap, and I think it's worthwhile answering so that we're absolutely sure which are the most accurate set of figures.
I think, Deputy, you'll know that the CSO themselves were very strong in their defence of their figures and their methodology, and it has never been brought into question before. That is our own independent Central Statistics Office that we depend on them for the collation of that. I don't think anyone's ever called in their expertise, their knowledge or their know-how into question before. You've raised a point in relation to completion certificates versus connections, and I think what we've always based our returns on is in relation to the CSO data, and I'm absolutely confident of that data. And I think, look, like all of you, you'll travel the country a lot. You'll see the momentum in house building that's out there at the moment, and when you see these social housing delivery figures as well, that will feed very much into our overall completions as well. So the CSO figures are the correct figures. I think for us to start to, I'm not saying you are, but to question those figures or the veracity of them is not something that I would support.
So let me just press you on that, because again, my question is not about the integrity of the CSO. In fact, I was one of the people who argued that they should have this responsibility. The key thing, however, is as follows. The CSO agreed a methodology back in 2018, and one of the reasons why they didn't use completion certificates at that stage is we were still at a very early stage of the BCMS system and new home completions, and they took the view, and I think it was the right view at the time, that the ESB connections data, with some caveats, was the best data set at that point in time. Things have changed, and the completion certificate and building control management system is much more advanced. So again, there's a question that needs to be explained. So for example, in Dublin City, the gap between the ESB connection figure and the completion certificate figure is 1,500 units. I think that gap needs to be explained. And I think rather than suggesting that somebody is questioning the integrity of the CSO, there's a really legitimate question here, which is why is the completion certificate data different? And again, I stress the point, a completion certificate is a legal requirement before a building can be occupied, whereas ESB connections can be before, can be after, can be extensions, can be all sorts of things. All I'm asking you is, do you not think it's worthwhile interrogating that question to make sure that, yes, the methodology was agreed in 2018. Is it still the best methodology? And by the way, it could well be. There could be a very simple explanation, or it could be that the methodology needs to be improved. And that's all many of us are asking you to consider. So how do you explain that difference between the two methodologies? Because 6,000 homes is a big difference.
I think firstly, look at the context of where this discussion came from. It came from the announcement of government of exceeding our targets under housing for all of 5,000. So I think, in fairness, it was in that context that this debate happened post that.
That's not the case, Minister. An independent commercial company has published an analysis. And I'm just asking you a question on the basis of their analysis.
Deputy, I'm going to
They have no
answer it.
bone to pick with the government's targets.
I think, Deputy, a commercial company, you're putting up a commercial company's data collection, and their
the data is public data from the building control.
The question and then the answer.
But it's my, Chair, in fairness, it's my time. And just to be clear, the data in question is publicly available to everybody. It is public data inputted onto the building control management system run by the Local Government Management Association. A private company, you're absolutely right, and I'm not making representations on behalf of anybody, has done an analysis and has published it. It's very detailed and it's very interesting. It has a different outcome to the ESB connections figures. How do you explain that difference? That's a reasonable question to ask. And you're avoiding answering it.
I'm actually not avoiding answering it, and if I was allowed to answer it, you interrupted me as I was endeavouring to answer it, Deputy. So what I would say to you is this: you know the CSO are independent of government, and they're independent, and their work is independent of us and me, and it's important that that happens. Now, if the statistics that are published by the state's own agency don't suit some other narratives, well, that is something that... That's not the question. I'm sorry. Okay, this again. There are two sets. And Chairman, I am trying to...
I know, but you're deflecting from the quick question. So let me ask it one more time. There are two sets of public data: ESB connections and completion certificates. They are both public data. They are giving us two different figures. All I'm asking you is, how do you explain the difference between those two figures? Again,
I'll try to endeavour to answer it, and I was going to make a suggestion that might be helpful to you, Deputy, because the CSO, as you know, are independent of me. The CSO have been very strong in their defence of the statistics that they released, which have been accepted year on year and year on year. It would be open to you, or indeed the committee, to call the CSO in.
I've done that, and I can't explain the difference, but as Minister, surely you want to know the difference.
We are very confident in the housing completion figures that we have, Deputy.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just asking you, how do you explain the difference?
Deputy, what I would say to you is, we don't reach into the CSO data, into their methodology as well. They publish that independently of me. So any further interrogation of that can be done at committee.
So you can't explain the difference between the two data sets? That's what you're saying, or you're not interested in the difference?
Deputy, your particular interest in this...
I'm asking you a very simple question.
I am trying to answer the question.
You're not. You're avoiding the question as usual, Minister.
This is about 40 seconds to get
all
the
I'm saying
answer
to you is this.
Been asked several times.
It is very obvious to those who watch in on this that you've taken the data from a private commercial company because it suits your narrative, because government have exceeded...
It's from the local government management agency.
Because government have exceeded our own completion targets and our delivery within the first year. And that might disappoint you, Deputy.
It doesn't. I would be delighted if that were the case.
That may disappoint you, but what I'm saying to you is this: it is open to you and indeed the committee, the CSO, to bring the CSO in and to ask them specifically their views, which, by the way, they issued a very strong statement in defence of their methodology.
Sure.
And for the main opposition party and others to call into question,
I'm not calling into question
the housing completion figures,
is
actually, I think, a real stretch now.
The CSO.
So
I'm simply asking you to explain something which you're avoiding explaining.
We're very transparent in the numbers that we publish, transparency in relation to our plan, our expenditure, unlike others, and we've put that forward very, very clearly. We've exceeded our housing targets last year. We intend to exceed them again this year. And any questions in relation to methodology and data itself that relates to the CSO, which I fully trust and has been the basis for tracking housing completions, is something that I certainly stand over. And if you have questions in relation to that, you call the CSO into committee and ask them that. So
I'm going to move on now.
Chair.
Thank you.